Nobody expected what Al Capone did when Frank Galluccio's razor found his face. May 30th, 1917, Harvard in Coney Island. The music was loud, the gin was flowing, and 18-year-old Alfonso Capone was working the floor like he owned the place, which, in his mind, he did. Frankie Yale's protege, the kid from Brooklyn with the quick fists and quicker mouth, the one everyone said would run all of New York someday. Then he saw her, Lena Galluccio, 19 years old, dark hair, eyes like midnight, dancing with some nobody from Manhattan. And Al Capone, drunk on bootleg whiskey and his own reputation, made the mistake that would mark him for life. He walked over to that girl and said the one thing you never say to another man's sister in front of half of Brooklyn. What happened next took 6 seconds by the time the blood stopped flowing. Al had 3 cuts that would never fully heal and a nickname that would make him the most famous gangster in American history. But here's what the history books don't tell you. When Frank Galluccio's blade opened Al's face like a ripe fruit, Al didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't even drop to his knees. He smiled. And that smile, that terrible blood-soaked smile, told everyone in the Harvard in exactly what kind of man they were looking at. Not a victim, not even a survivor. Something else. Something dangerous. Something that would make Chicago tremble for the next 15 years. But to understand that moment, you need to understand the world that created it. The Harvard Inn wasn't just a speakeasy. It was Frankie Yale's kingdom. The crown jewel of his Brooklyn empire, a former dancehall turned into the most popular illegal drinking establishment on Coney Island, where the city's elite came to rub shoulders with gangsters, politicians, and anyone else with enough money to buy their way past the doorman. The year was 1917, and America was at war, not just overseas in the trenches of France, but right here at home. The war between the waits and the dries, between the people who wanted to drink and the people who wanted to stop them. Prohibition was coming. Everyone could smell it in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and smart men like Frankie Yale were preparing for the opportunities it would bring. Yale was 30 years old, born Francesco Ioli in Calabria before his family brought him to Brooklyn as a child. He'd built his reputation one bloody fight at a time, working his way up from street muscle to the undisputed boss of South Brooklyn. That's why he'd taken Al Capone under his wing 3 years earlier. The kid was only 15 when Yale first noticed him, but he already had something that couldn't be taught: absolute fearlessness. Not the stupid kind that gets you killed, but the calculated kind that makes other men nervous. Yale had started Al as a bartender at the Harvard Inn, mixing drinks and keeping his ears open. Perfect training for a young man who needed to learn how power really worked. Behind that mahogany bar, Al watched politicians make deals with gangsters. He saw police captains take cash. He learned that in America, everything was for sale if you knew the right price. By 1917, Al was more than just a bartender. He was Yale's eyes and ears, the one who spotted trouble, who made sure the right palms got greased and the wrong people got discouraged. At 18, he was already making more money than most men twice his age. He dressed in expensive suits, carried himself like royalty, and had convinced himself that he was untouchable. That was his first mistake. His second mistake walked through the doors of the Harvard Inn at exactly 9:30 p.m. on May 30th, 1917. Frank Galluccio was 25 years old, built like a prizefighter, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from stone. He worked the docks during the day and did favors for various neighborhood crews at night. Nothing fancy, nothing that would attract federal attention. Just the kind of quiet muscle work that kept Brooklyn's delicate ecosystem in balance. With him was his sister Lena, and that's where Al's story really begins. Lena Galluccio was the kind of beautiful that made strong men stupid. Not just pretty, beautiful in a way that seemed almost dangerous, like staring directly into the sun. She had the kind of face that belonged in Renaissance paintings, the kind of figure that made men write bad poetry and start unnecessary fights. And she was completely, utterly off limits to anyone who wanted to keep breathing. Frank had brought her to the Harvard Inn because she'd begged him for weeks. All her friends talked about the glamorous speakeasy where movie stars and millionaires danced to jazz music and drank illegal champagne. She wanted to see it for herself, just once, just for her 19th birthday. Frank had finally given in, but with strict rules she would stay by his side. She wouldn't drink, and they would leave by 10 o'clock. Lena had agreed to everything, but she hadn't counted on the intoxicating atmosphere of Yale's kingdom. The music was hot jazz that pulsed through the floorboards. The people were fascinating, women in short dresses and men in tailored suits, all moving like they owned the world. She'd been dancing with Tommy Morrison, a harmless clerk from Manhattan. Frank was watching from a nearby table, nursing a beer and keeping one eye on his sister. Everything was going perfectly. Then Al Capone noticed her. He was behind the bar, polishing glasses and observing the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who learned to read people like newspapers. When Lena laughed at something Tommy said, the sound cut through the music like a bell. Al looked up, saw her face in profile as she spun around the dance floor, and felt something shift in his chest. Al Capone was used to getting what he wanted. Yale's protection, his own reputation, and a wallet full of cash had made him accustomed to a world where doors opened and obstacles disappeared. He'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. So when the song ended and Lena walked back toward her brother's table, Al made his move. He came out from behind the bar, straightening his tie, smoothing back his hair, putting on the charming smile that had talked him out of trouble more times than he could count. "Excuse me, beautiful," Al said, his voice carrying just enough Brooklyn accent to sound dangerous but not enough to sound crude. "How about a dance with someone who knows what he's doing?" Lena stopped, looked him up and down, taking in the expensive suit, the slicked back hair, the cocky grin. She could see immediately what kind of man he was, the kind who was used to taking what he wanted without asking permission. "Thank you, but no," she said politely. "I'm here with my brother." Any smart man would have smiled, apologized, and walked away. Al Capone was smart, but he was also 18 years old and drunk on his own power. "Come on, sweetheart," he said, moving closer. "One dance. I promise you'll have more fun with me than with that sad sack you were dancing with." I said no. Lena's voice was firm now, with an edge that should have warned him. But Al was already reaching for her hand, already assuming she would give in like everyone else did. That's when he made the comment that changed everything. The crude joke about what Italian girls were really good at. The offensive suggestion about what she could do for him after the dance. The words that no decent man says to any woman, let alone to another man's sister in front of half of Brooklyn. Lena's face went white, then red. The insult hit her like a physical blow. But before she could respond, before she could even fully process what had just happened, her brother was there. Frank Galluccio had been watching the interaction from his table, initially amused by some pretty boy trying to charm his sister. But when he saw her face change, when he read the shock and humiliation in her expression, Frank understood exactly what had happened. And Frank Galluccio was not the kind of man who let insults to his family slide. "What did you just say to my sister?" Frank's voice was quiet, but it carried across the dance floor like thunder. Conversations stopped, heads turned. Even the band seemed to play softer. Al turned around, and for the first time that night, his confidence flickered. Frank Galluccio was bigger than him, older than him, and radiating controlled violence. "Hey, no disrespect intended, pal," Al said, trying to recover his footing. "Just having a conversation with a lady, that's what you call it, a conversation." Frank stepped closer, and Al could smell the honest sweat of hard work on him, so different from the cologne and pomade of Yale's crowd. "Because it looked to me like you were talking to my sister like she was some $2 whore." The Harvardian went completely silent. Even the piano player stopped mid-note. 30 people held their breath, waiting to see how this would play out. In the corner, Frankie Yale watched with the cold calculation of a man who'd seen 1,000 such confrontations. "Look, friend," Al said, his hands raised in what he thought was a peaceful gesture. "Maybe there was a misunderstanding. How about I buy you both a drink and we forget the whole thing?" Frank's laugh was like gravel being poured into a bucket. "A misunderstanding? Do you think calling my sister a whore is a misunderstanding?" That's when Al made his final fatal mistake. Instead of apologizing, instead of backing down, instead of showing even the slightest bit of respect for the man whose family he'd just insulted, Al Capone let his 18-year-old ego take control of his mouth. "AI calls them like I sees them," Al said, his Brooklyn accent getting thicker as his temper rose. "And what I see is a broad who dresses like that. She's probably looking for attention." Frank Galluccio moved faster than anyone expected. His right hand went to his coat pocket and came back out with 4 inches of razor-sharp steel before Al could react, before anyone could intervene. Frank's blade traced 3 perfect lines across the left side of Al's face. The first cut ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a diagonal slash that opened up like a second smile. The second cut went from just below his left eye to his chin, a vertical line that bisected the first cut at a perfect right angle. The third cut was smaller, running from the corner of his eye to his temple, an artistic flourish that completed Frank's message. Blood poured down Al's face like red rain, staining his white shirt, ruining his expensive suit. He staggered backward, his hands flying to his cheek, feeling the wetness, the heat, the unthinkable reality that someone had actually dared to mark him. For a moment, the entire Harvardian held its breath. 30 people waited to see what would happen next. Would Al scream? Would he run? Would he collapse from shock and blood loss? Instead, Al Capone did something that no one expected. He smiled. Not a grimace of pain, not a rictus of shock. A genuine smile, wide, bloody, and absolutely terrifying. He took his hands away from his face, looked at the blood on his palms, and started to laugh. "Well," Al said, his voice steady despite the rivers of blood running down his face, "I guess that's one way to end a conversation." Frank stood there, razor still in his hand, staring at this kid who was laughing while his face leaked blood onto the Harvardian's polished floor. Everyone in Brooklyn knew that when Frank Galluccio cut someone, they stayed cut. They learned their lesson. They showed proper respect afterward. They didn't laugh. "You think this is funny?" Frank asked, genuinely confused. Al pulled out his handkerchief and pressed it to the deepest cut, the one running from ear to mouth. The white cotton immediately turned red. "Funny? No. Educational? Absolutely." Al's eyes never left Frank's face. "You just taught me something important about respect, about consequences, about what happens when you push the wrong man's family." The Harvardian was still dead silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Frankie Yale was watching with something like surprise in his eyes. "Here's what I'm going to do, Frank," Al continued, still pressing the bloody handkerchief to his face. "I'm going to walk out of here. I'm going to get these cuts stitched up. and I'm going to remember this lesson for the rest of my life. But I'm also going to remember who taught it to me." Frank's grip tightened on the razor. "That a threat? No, it's a promise. Someday, when I'm in a position to return favors, I'm going to find you, and I'm going to thank you properly for the education you gave me tonight." Al straightened his tie with his free hand, smoothed back his blood-matted hair, and walked toward the door. Every step was measured, controlled, dignified despite the gore running down his face. At the door, he stopped and turned back to Frank and Lena. "Ma'am," he said to Lena, tipping his hat with the hand that wasn't holding the handkerchief to his face. "I apologize for my inappropriate language. You deserved better." Then he looked at Frank. "And you, my friend, you did exactly what a good brother should do. I respect that, more than you know." Al Capone walked out into the Brooklyn night, bleeding and scarred but somehow more dangerous than when he'd walked in. The Harvard Inn stayed silent for another full minute. Then someone started talking, then someone else, and within minutes, the place was buzzing with whispered conversations about what they'd just witnessed. Frankie Yale walked over to Frank Galluccio, who was still standing in the middle of the dance floor, razor in his hand, looking like he wasn't sure what had just happened. "That was interesting," Yale said quietly. "What do you mean?" Yale smiled, not the warm smile he used for customers, but the cold one he saved for business. "Most men, when they get cut like that, they either run or they come back with guns. But that kid, he's going to remember this, and when he does, it won't be about revenge. It'll be about respect." Frank put the razor back in his pocket. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you just gave Al Capone the most valuable lesson he'll ever learn, and someday he's going to thank you for it." Yale was right. 10 years later, when Al Capone controlled Chicago's underworld, he kept his promise to Frank Galluccio. He found Frank working construction in Brooklyn and offered him a job as a personal bodyguard. Frank took it for 8 years, until Capone went to prison. Frank Galluccio was one of the few men Al trusted with his life. The 3 cuts that Frank's razor had carved became Al's trademark. Scarface, the most famous nickname in criminal history, worn like a badge of honor by the man who learned that true power comes not from avoiding consequences, but from how you handle them when they come. Years later, a reporter asked Al about the scars, whether he regretted the confrontation that marked him for life. Al just smiled, that same bloody smile he'd shown in the Harvard Inn, and said, "Those scars are the best thing that ever happened to me. They remind me that respect has to be earned, not taken." Because that night in the Harvard Inn, when an 18-year-old punk learned that actions have consequences, when he realized that respect is something you earn through blood and scars, that was the night Al Capone really began. The scars never disappeared. The lesson lasted forever, and Chicago would never be the same.